Tashile. Welcome to the Awam Tibetan Buddhist Institute in Tucson, Arizona. And our class for today is a class on the heart essence of Tibetan Buddhism. This is the first one of these, and so we'll just be doing the first day of this, which will last over quite a few different days. So we begin just by welcoming you here. These notes are highlights from the book that I wrote on this, The Innate Happiness. Looks like this. Get it from Amazon. And so sometimes I'm reading directly from it, sometimes I'm commenting on it as a part of that. And so this is used for the presentation that I'm making for you and the teaching. And so it's important that you also read the text. You should have received a copy of the sequence of things that we're going through as a part of the syllabus, and so it tells you exactly when and what chapters and so forth that you should be reading as a part of that, and so hopefully you will do that. And please ask questions. If you have any questions in the process of reading, let me know. You can email me at kempo.drime, which is D-R-I-M-E-D, period, dawa, D-A-W-A, at gmail.com. Or you can also email me at email Awam, it's both of those words, email Awam TBI at gmail.com. And if you didn't get those, you can go to our website and you can find those there. So I hope I get to know each of you as we move along as a part of this. So my background can be found on our website. If you go to awaminstitute.org on the About Us page, and there you can find briefly that I have spent about 30 plus years study and practice of Buddhism and teaching and writing. And so previously I was a computer programmer, and then I also became a manager and went into financial management, and then also became a management professor. So that's a very brief background. So let's begin with a short form of meditation. First, just take a deep breath, and then very slowly let it out. Again. And out. One more time. Out. So this is one of the most basic forms of meditation practices, not only in Buddhism, but in many different forms as well. And so it's part of the heart of the most of meditation practices. There are things that are very similar to it, some are not very similar to it, and yet it's still embedded as a part of the heart of the practices. So it's easy to do. And while I recommend doing at least 15 to 20 minutes twice a day, this is something that you can do all the time. Little gaps in your day. If you're watching TV, this is one of my favorites. And ads come on, stop the ads, mute the ads, and then use it as an opportunity for meditation. Or if you're sitting in your car at a red light, stop, meditate, or at least a couple deep breaths. And those kind of activities that we experience, waiting in line somewhere or sitting in, waiting for a meeting to occur, those kind of things are opportunities, and repetition is so important in mastering these skills. And so please take every opportunity that you get to do those kind of practices. So the path of Buddhism is a matter of study and practice. This helps us to eliminate our discontent or dukkha, or sufferings as it's often translated, unhappiness, various words that are used. You'll hear me talk about it in different ways. And we replace those with discontent, replace our discontent with liberation or moksha. Sometimes peace. The Buddha oftentimes used the word peace to describe this, or mental calm and contentment. So that's the idea of just when we breathe in, regardless of the practice that we're doing, we're letting go of everything else at that moment of time. So this is called mind training, and it's the heart of our practices toward liberation. And at the heart mind, training are three categories of practice: ethics, meditation, and insight, or sometimes wisdom. So ethics is, in essence, do good or at least do no harm. That's the way the Dalai Lama often repeats it. A very simple guide emphasized for this kind of experience and practice that we have in our daily lives. These are elaborated as 5 different characteristics. Those are no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying, and no intoxication, or some versions say no alcohol at all. Later, we will add other commitments, such as the Bodhisattva vows, and those are to benefit other beings with loving kindness and compassion. And then there are also various tantric vows when we get into the tantra part of the course. We'll see some other ones as well. So we begin with ethics, and then the second stage is meditations. Our book, Innate Happiness, has over 52 specific meditations that we will be looking at it. They're very ideal for householders, very concise and short as a part of that, so it doesn't take a great deal of time to do them and repeat them. And so this is one of the reasons that I have selected these particular practices, to make it easy for most of us that have very little time on our hands in our lives. So the third stage, the insight or wisdom, is the 3 parts of mind training. This is the most complex across all the branches of Buddhism. So the ethics is fairly consistent. And we go into forms of meditation, you'll find some more variations. But when you get into the wisdom aspect, there's actually quite a few. And so we won't look at all of those. That would take the whole course to just do that. And maybe even then we wouldn't be able to get through it all. So one of the 3 parts, this idea of mind training, is that it's the most complex part of the branches of Buddhism, but we will narrow the range, primarily in our focus of the Nyingma lineage. And we'll talk about basic lineages here momentarily, of the Tibetan Buddhism of which we are a part. So be sure to follow the syllabus as a part of these. Read the chapters before class each week, if at all possible. Send me the questions that you may have, and I will do my best to answer them during the Sunday presentation. And if we're not able to do that, certainly I can send you an email as well. So the key points from the preface of the Innate Happiness book, there's 3 parts for today. The preface, chapter 1, which is the introduction, and chapter 2, the historical background. So hopefully you have read all of these. In the preface, there are 3 groups of Buddhist students: the householders, like us, the forest dwellers, which are yogis and yoginis, and sometimes the yogis and yoginis actually are like us, ordinary beings, and sometimes they're like the 3rd category, monastics, the monks and the nuns, who sometimes also then engage in it as a yogi or yogini. A somewhat later development in his teachings. So what is really possible here? The Dzogchen Penlop Rinpoche says, I'm going to read a little bit here from the text itself, that yes, you're a Buddha too. You have the same enlightened potential. You can wake at any minute, just like Shakyamuni Buddha and many others. We're trying to see how these teachings exist in our everyday life, taking piano lessons, driving our kids to school, walking home from the bar, or locking ourselves in a 3-year retreat. They're all the same. So, continuing then, there are also key differences in time and place between India at the time of the Buddha and our experiences today. So the cultures, religious views, and so forth, but especially science. Science has made a huge difference in our understanding of the way things are, the nature of things, and so forth, that are discussed a lot in Buddhism, but they had no background of science. And so that part of it has really changed quite a bit. So what we now understand is this is part of what is called the relative world in Buddhism. But many of the problems that we face on a daily basis are really quite similar to the ones of the time of the Buddha. And so science can make a difference. The Dalai Lama has been very supportive of science, advocating, supporting inclusion of science in Tibetan education, meeting with groups of scientists once or twice a year, even saying that we must become 21st century Buddhists. That's part of what we are trying to do here. So I fully support this. I also believe that human beings can actually benefit in some ways from the stories that are sometimes referred to as myth and magic in Buddhism, or other religions for that matter, of the ancient, if not contemporary, cultures as well. So first we need to know that not only are these stories, referred to as stories, but they're nearly everything we say or read. Words themselves are symbols of meaning and not always precise. They contain a lot of symbolism that can be helpful to our understanding, even if we do not believe them in a literal way. And even science includes numerous terms of words to symbolize their research findings. So don't just reject those ideas, nor should those who take the myth and magic literally ignore science and other contemporary views and understandings. So everything is a story in some way. And so that's an important concept for us to realize in some way. So patience and persistence are also a part of our practice, important principles in Buddhism. We use these to help create new habits, training the mind through repetitions. That's why the repetition of that real simple meditation practice that I mentioned, both eliminating bad or harmful things, referred to oftentimes as hindrances. There's various lists in Buddhism we'll talk more about later, and replacing with the good, or liberation. So we'll get rid of the bad and we replace it with the good, if you will. So that's a very brief introduction. And so now we go on to chapter 1, some questions to consider. So the first one is, why practice Buddhism? Well, generally it has always been related to eliminating the bad and replacing it with the good, as I just mentioned, eliminating the hindrances and replacing them with liberation. Others describe it as well-being. It's a word that is often used in our culture as well. A common focus in modern psychology, with many parallels. Meditation has been adopted as one of the tools to assist contemporary humans. Another question, what about this form of Buddhism? There are any number of options, even contemporary creations. One key desire of Buddhists is seeking happiness, not by winning the lottery, but getting some control over our sufferings, leading to well-being. But it is not all under our control, as sometimes articulated in Buddhism. One research study found that happiness is not completely within our control. They found that about 50% of our experiences are not within our control. They're primarily based on DNA, at least for now. Maybe we'll be able to change DNA at some point. We're working on those. Another 10% were found to be somewhat within our control, at least we have some choices in those matters. These include things like earthquakes, floods, volcanoes, and people who run red lights. So we have to be careful, get out of the way if there's warnings about some of these things, and we do that. If we're driving through our green light and somebody runs right through it with the red light, if we're careful, we watch for those kinds of things to happen, then our odds are much better than if we just take off the minute it turns green. So these include those, we do things to help escape severe levels. So we need to be careful. It doesn't guarantee no harm, but there is at least a chance. So that leaves 40% over which we do have considerable control. Buddhism makes it appear like we're 100%, as I mentioned, under control, but we need to accept that this is really not the case. But there are things that we can do to help ourselves and others in the process. It is within this window that we have our best opportunity. It is about our intention. We may not all be the same, but that's okay. The key here is our views, your needs, your goals, habituation, training your mind. Get rid of the bad as best you can and repeat them with the good. Why this form of Buddhism? Another question. There are many variations, and often this is a matter of culture. But this is not a factor for most of us in the United States or other Western countries. There are many variations. A Buddhist text says there are 84,000 of those. Most acknowledge that this is just a big number for meaning a lot, but very common in ancient civilizations to give big numbers for things like that. But I have heard at least one Lama say that there is such a list. I've never seen it. But this is not part of this class. It would take the whole class to go over that many things. But briefly, we will examine at least part of the paths of individual liberation, the Bodhisattva path, then focus most of our time on Tantra and Dzogchen. So those are the four main paths in Tibetan Buddhism. The recognition of individual liberation, which comes from the Pali tradition, and then the Bodhisattva path, which tended to emerge roughly the same time, but appears to have had documents primarily a little bit later. So Buddhism then is a living kind of tradition. So it has and will probably continue to change from time to time. Change happens, the good or the bad. So can you really attain liberation as a householder? Certainly there are some monastics who think that we can't. And just go through a series of lives, maybe we'll improve the series of lives. I already cited one source on this in the preface. Here is another from Mipam Rinpoche, page 7, if you have the text here. Down at the bottom, Mipam Rinpoche is a really great master and lived in the late 1800s and into the 1900s, so a fairly contemporary individual. And so he says that according to the sutras, which are the teachings of the Buddha, one can become enlightened in 1 week. Okay? That's pretty quickly. Most of us probably won't be successful at that. But the point is that we can do that kind of thing. We can achieve that kind of thing. Find where I left off here. So Buddhism is a living tradition. It is something that is continuing. It is, as I mentioned, changing, for good or bad. But can you really attain liberation as a householder was the question that I had asked. And the quote according to Mipam Rinpoche, yes, you can. And not only that, you can do it within a week. So some will say that you must become monastic, as I mentioned before, but there are teachings from the Buddha that differ with that view. And we'll look at some of those in a little bit. Padmasambhava is considered the source of the root text being used for innate happiness in this class. It is in it are his teachings on the 6 bardos. So that's the core of what that text is about, his teachings in that particular one. And they are filled with very concise practices, which are very appropriate for Buddhist studies in the West. So it's one of the reasons that I selected it. When I first was taught that, and I've received that teaching several times, but I was amazed at how concise those practices were and how powerful they could actually be for people as well. So I did have to reorganize the sequence that was taught as a part of that, because the original source was based on a different consideration, the 6 bardos. So I recognized them to fit more common and natural sequence, filling in a few places that didn't have practices that were needed. So Buddha means one who is awake, literally. We are awake. Later described as having a true understanding of the true nature of things, the way things are versus the way things appear. And so that's a philosophical understanding, generally speaking, about the way things are versus our ordinary experiences of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and the way that we process those in our brain as well. So we'll go into those in more depth later on, but we find it in all of the different branches of Buddhism. But the Buddha also suggested that we not take his word for it. We need to test it, just as a goldsmith tests the purity of gold before buying it. We also when asked how to know what teachings are authentic after he died, he stated that if the teachings are consistent with the Dharma, his teachings that he had already given, don't challenge them just based on the questions about the source. So the source is not what's critical, that it's more consistent with the teachings that he gave. So that's the kind of things that are in the first chapter for you to consider. Now chapter 2, we conclude with chapter 2 here, historical background. A brief life story on the historical Buddha. First, there are numerous stories about the historical Buddha. We get a very common kind of a story in our readings in the West. Maybe they tweak it a little bit here or there, but there are actually a number of different stories that have been written about the Buddha. I've shared some highlights in Innate Happiness book, while also having to make some choices. All Buddhist authors have to do that because there are multiple choices, and whether they acknowledge that that's what they've done or not. First, it is important to know that there were no alphabets in the vast number of Indian languages during and for the 200 to 300 years after the time of the Buddha, hence a reason it became an oral tradition. So it is pointed out by Bhikkhu Bodhi, Buddhists tried to base this on the Proto-Sanskrit model. Proto-languages, including the Proto-Sanskrit language, it's like in Egypt, where everything, a word is written down and symbolized by a picture. And so earliest languages, that was the way that those were identified and written. But it was very difficult for somebody to really understand that many words, and also for them to be able then to read it and understand the meaning of all of that. And so it took a long time after that, started in other places, but eventually worked its way into India. And there we began seeing the development of the languages of India, of which there are many, hundreds literally. And they became developing their own alphabet in order to write things down. But it still took a long time before very much of that was done in the context of Buddhism, because they had developed this habit of it being an oral tradition. So as we're looking at this, so I said that it was about 200 to 300 years later. And so it is a reason it became the oral tradition. As pointed out by Bhikkhu Bodhi, Buddhists tried to base this on this Proto-Sanskrit model in which the texts were memorized by young children who are, interestingly enough, capable of memorizing vast information without having to understand any of it. Kind of interesting. Their brains they're just ripe for those kinds of things, and it was very effective. But the Buddhists used advanced, often older practitioners and numerous Indian languages, not just a single language. So what could go wrong? Well, in addition to that, the texts were eventually written, and only much later versions are still available, have been considerably consistent. So it's almost like a miracle that these texts, as much variation as have emerged through them over time, is that they still retain a great deal of consistency as a part of that, in spite of all of those differences as well. Well, what about the life of the Buddha? I took a little sidestep there, but the life of the Buddha was apparently of little interest until about 300 years after the life of the Buddha. And so the focus was on his teachings. As the stories that we have are highly questionable, and many parts are or have been identified as being adapted from other stories. So some of the stories, of which there are many different stories of the Buddha's life, those have things that scholars have been able to identify the source of those were from other places in their culture. So they put those together and said, okay, here's the life of the Buddha. And they have similarities, but they also have a lot of differences in the details. So one of the differences that I noted in my text, Innate Happiness, is the way his stories changed over time. Theravada, a human teacher with human limitations, abilities, and death, is the way that he is articulated, the Buddha is articulated by the Theravada tradition, versus the Mahayana tradition, in which part of Tibet views are included there, of a transcendent cosmic figure who surpasses even the great gods of India in wisdom and power. And he did not die, but still appears to those needing help. There are a few more details around this in the book. So we have those two, broadly speaking, but there are also many variations in both of those general views. Another influence at the time of the Buddha was the ancient classical Vedas. And so the Vedic tradition, and we had the classical part of that. The Buddha used some of the principles, such as moksha, liberation, attachment to samsara, meaning an endless cycle of life and source of unhappiness, following the laws of karma. Literally means actions, but becoming divided between good, bad, and neutral over time. That appears to have been going on during the life of the Buddha. And rejected the ultimate concepts of the Vedas, such as Brahman, and ultimate, out of which comes all things, into which all things then return, as well as the view Vedic priests who believe in the permanent soul or self that eventually returned into Brahman. And so he rejected the idea of Brahman. He also rejected the idea of self and soul, which he differentiated between those terms. Another influence at that time was the Shramana movement. Wandering ascetics who sought liberation through extreme forms of ascetic practices. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha to be, but not his real name, which is unknown. Nor was he a prince, and his father a king. Those are in almost all of the stories about his life. But scholars have found that the region in which they are said to live have been found to be a republic, not a kingdom. No king, he wasn't a prince, things were different then. And as a result, they were more like a form of, say, governance of a county here in the United States. So his search for liberation, the Buddha's search, we are told that at age 29, he also sought to find a path of liberation. So he became very discontent with what was going on and wherever it was he lived and whatever it was that they believed. I have included brief versions of the stories about him mastering the teachings, leaving discontented in both cases, and finding his teachers, trying a more extreme asceticism of 5 others who almost left him dead. So he first went to 2 different teachers that are often described in the text, that he did certain practices as a part, he mastered those, but was discontented, went on, and eventually he had these 5 different other companions, and they got together to do these real extreme versions of asceticism. And as a part of that, it left him almost dead. He was discovered, according to the stories at least, lying on the side of the road, almost dead there's several different stories here too, but one of them was this young girl had this bowl full of rice milk and was going to make it as an offering to a tree. And so she gave that to him, and she continued to come back day after day to help him recover from that. And after he did, he left, went out on his own, sitting under, as we are aware of it, the Bodhi tree. So it's a form of a fig tree, if you will, for an unspecified time. We have a leaf of a fig tree over here, a Bodhi tree. According to the legend, he sat meditating only early in one morning, and the morning star, which would be Venus, caught his attention and became a metaphor for the dawning of clear light. Clear as in pure, or is that clear, and light as an awareness, lighting or illuminating the way. And so it's a metaphor for pure awareness, which is a term that we use in Dzogchen a lot, or Rigpa. Emphasized these centuries later in the path of great perfection. So these, of course, led to his teachings of the experience and insights from that. And so we have what have come down to us as the Four Noble Truths. So the first is the truth of suffering or unhappiness. The second is the truth or source of cause. Our fundamental ignorance is often used as a part of that, but also it's described as understanding the true nature of things. If we don't understand it, then that represents the lack of the truth. And so the third one is the truth of cessation or liberation. And then the fourth one is the path of that, the truth of the path of liberation, which is described often as training the mind. So a little more detail on these, because these are critical to understand in our practice and understanding of the teachings that have been given. So the first truth, suffering, unhappiness, dissatisfaction, or imperfection. So there are a lot of different expressions that have been used to explain that. All pervasive suffering, unhappiness, discontent, etc., were said to come from our attachments to objects of desire. So desire is a problem, a key problem that the Buddha emphasizes a lot. It manifests as greed or jealousy. And others are pride or arrogance. from our achievements, our ego, our sense of self, talking, the way that we talk about ourselves and the way we talk about others. So these lead to other negative behaviors due to our ignorance, desire, and anger, often called the three poisons. Those are really at the root of some of the teachings of the Buddha, which along with ego then create much of the discontent that we experience in our lives. Now, here, another point that we need to be aware of today is, remember that I mentioned science and the importance of science in helping us understand ourselves and what's going on in the world today. And they had no science at the time of the Buddha. It's a relatively recent development. But as a part of science, one of the key factors has to do with our brain. Our brain affects our experience in the form of our mind, and our mind affects our brain. They are interdependent. It's not usually described that way, but the scholars point that out. There are three major parts and a number of others within these. The first is the primitive or reptilian brain. It's focused on the survival and always alert to danger. These are simplistic kinds of explanations. Number two is the subcortical structure, which holds both a short and long-term memory and process of emotions. And the third is the modern part, the cortex, which is kind of the frontal and so forth part. It's slower and allows us to think and communicate, bond together, collaborate, and love. The executive functions are sometimes described. It also calms the anxiety of the reptilian and subcortical brain. So that part of the brain has emerged, and they had that kind of part of the brain at the time of the Buddha, but it is one of the things that has allowed us to develop these kinds of functions and levels of understanding. But they didn't have the use of that brain in order to understand things from a scientific point of view, which is also important. So part of our thinking process includes our senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. Usually in our culture, those five. But in Buddhism, they add another one, which is thinking. And then the feelings associated with that, going into what is referred to a sixth sense. Feelings, the word feelings in Tibetan Buddhism and in India generally, doesn't have the same level of understandings as we do. It's usually a very simple explanation in terms of being something that is either good, bad, or neutral. And that's about all that it is. Whereas we have long lists of different kinds of feelings, emotions, and those kind of things. Now, it's not that they don't have those, it's just that they didn't include them in that idea of a feeling per se. So each of the six has also a form of consciousness. And so this is considered to be a sense organ and is not part of the brain. So there is no such other organ the way that they understand it, but they had a sense that, well, maybe there is something other than the experience that we have of it as well, because all of the other five have organs associated with them. The lack of understanding of the brain, and without a sense organ for the brain, the understandings of ancient Buddhism, even until now, present controversial understanding and processes for training the brain. We don't see that term in Buddhism. It's training the mind, not the brain. As noted earlier, the Dalai Lama has held annual meetings with scientists and encouraged science training for Tibetans as well. He is open to changing Buddhism to accept valid evidence from science. He is also frequently said, in the last number of years at least, that we need to become 21st century Buddhists. So that's part of what we are trying to do as well. We'll comment a little more on that in a bit. The second truth is the source or cause of suffering. So our brain structure is one source of this discontent, if you will. While we have no direct control, we can train our mind, our brain, to create new neural pathways. The Buddha knew from his Shramana experience, the extreme version of asceticism, that we misunderstand the nature of our mind. This is our fundamental ignorance, the way that it is articulated in Buddhism. All sentient beings are said to want happiness and avoid suffering or discontent, the causes of this ignorance. Modern psychology and neuroscience articulate two types of happiness, hedonic and eudaimonia. The first is based on sense pleasures and external sources and is short-term, relative, and ordinary or everyday forms of happiness. Because it is temporary, it leads to what is referred to as the hedonic treadmill, a term that you may have run across here or there. A continuous desire to seek more and more, seeking pleasure beyond pleasure. But we know now that it is not sustainable, and it leads to greed. This contrasts with eudaimonia, which is a deeper happiness related to mental outlook, meaning, and positive emotions, such as love, compassion, and generosity. It is a long-term and more ultimate form to an experience of overall well-being. It is cultivated from within and is not dependent upon anything external. So we have a dramatic difference between these two approaches. But in our culture, you very seldom hear the word eudaimonia. You may hear about some of the meanings associated with it, but rarely do we hear the term. Furthermore, our happiness is not black and white. According to the 40% solution, 50% of our happiness comes from our genetics, and over which we have no control, our set point, if you will. 10% comes from our circumstances in our life, over which we have little or no control, leaving only 40% for intentional activity over which we have control of our actions. But it requires our intention. So it doesn't automatically happen, but we have to have our intention. And that word, intention, is one of the most important words in Buddhism. The actions that we take. Karma, for example, we'll come back to this later on, but karma just means actions, as mentioned before, and then it emerges into good, bad, and neutral kind of actions, activities as a part of that. But in Buddhism, although you don't hear this very often, it's articulated as your intention as to whether or not it's good or bad. So you may accidentally do something that harms someone, but you're not going to get a negative effect in your karma because of that. Only if you intend to and then harm someone will you face those kinds of considerations. So the Buddha noted that our sense of self or ego, due to our fundamental ignorance, is what leads to desire and attachment, or anger and aversion. We act as if we have some permanent or inherent existence. The brain feeds on this by helping us construct boundaries that differentiate ourself from what is outside of us and the other. This leads to us want. And all we do is want. We believe consumerism is the answer. Bumper sticker says, "He who dies with the most toys wins." Or the movie Wall Street, a number of years ago, Mr. Gecko tells us greed is good. And we see a lot of that right now in our culture and what's going on here in the United States as well. So we wind up suffering and are discontented by our own fundamental ignorance and understanding. And so that's at the heart of Buddhism. The sense of imperfection is a form of perception. We are focused on our self-interest over that and of others more often than not. We do not see the bigger picture and the true nature of what we call reality that I hinted at previously. Most religions and spiritual traditions posit a non-material reality, something beyond our five senses, or what we call empirical reality. Some give it a name: God, Allah, Brahman, the Tao, Dharmakaya, which is a Tibetan Buddhist word, and so forth. Conceptualizations may vary somewhat, but none of them can be observed through ordinary senses. This is what is referred to as ultimate reality, this focus of wisdom within which these traditions, including Buddhism, are embedded. Lack of this insight is ignorance, a source of suffering on our journey. So the third noble truth here is the truth of cessation. So we have the problem, the cause, and the source of that cause. And so now, how do we cease doing that? In achieving liberation, the Buddha sought something more permanent. The answer was found in addressing our ignorance of the true nature of mind and the true nature of things, our worldview. He compared it to a candle burning out when the fuel is used up. In this analogy, what is being burned up is our negative karma and habitual tendencies. He specifically addresses them as ignorance or delusion, attachment, desire or greed, and aversion or hatred. These are the three fires. And nirvana literally means blowing out those fires. So again, we're getting rid of the bad, replacing it with the good. At the same time, he noted that change happens. Nothing seems permanent, and indeed, this is true. Science tells us that systems entropy, decline in their energy over time. Seasons change. The earth continues to rotate through a cycle of day and night. Time marches on. The only thing permanent is change itself, or so it seems. Impermanence allows this change to happen. If there was no change, we would be stuck in our fundamental ignorance. Liberation would be impossible. But because of impermanence, the Buddha was able to awaken, and so can we. With the cessation of discontent, our innate happiness blossoms. There is a deep inner peace with no attachment or aversion, and with great loving kindness and compassion for all. Let me read that again. With the cessation of discontent, our innate happiness blossoms. There is a deep inner peace with no attachment or aversion, and with the great loving kindness and compassion for all. That short sentence is the essence of what Buddhism is really all about. But happiness should not be confused with pleasure. When we pursue pleasure, we are seeking temporary form of happiness. Happiness is certainly not about money. Studies show, for example, that except in cases of extreme poverty, there is no correlation between one's wealth and one's happiness beyond a temporary effect from a significant increase. So you win the lottery, it feels really good for a short period of time, and then it goes away. So true happiness comes from inner peace, contentment, and satisfaction in our lives. Inner peace Best comes from training our mind. There's that word again. It's a matter of learning, experiencing, and abiding in our sense of well-being. When you can remain continuously in this state, you will experience blissful surrender and true inner peace. This is a goal described as nirvana, pure lands, or heaven in various traditions. In some, it is in the next life. In others, it is here and now. So heaven is within, so to speak. So there are different views within Buddhism, and so we'll be talking about those as we go through this course. Yet even inner peace by itself is not the ultimate. Happiness for yourself fails to meet the ethical consideration of transcending self for the benefit of others. Thus, ultimate happiness engages an altruistic intention to benefit all others in also realizing inner peace through the intention and actions to benefit everyone. We are all, in a sense at least, interrelated, interdependent, and interconnected. Only when we consider the common good of all can we achieve our own state of ultimate happiness. Shantideva, one of the great masters in Tibetan Buddhism, said, "All the suffering in the world comes from the desire for our own happiness. All the happiness in the world comes from our desire for the happiness of others." So having that happiness, that sense of happiness, helping, giving to others is what leads to our own happiness. Fortunately, interdependence works in both directions. We are dependent upon others, but also they are dependent upon us. Anything that we do to benefit others, even one other, tends to have a beneficial effect that extends in subtle ways to others. In some cases, this comes from a chain of cause and effect. We help one, who helps another, who then goes on and on and on and so forth. As Gandhi said, we must be the change we seek. So then we finally get to the fourth noble truth here, which is training the mind. So this appears to have originally been just the middle way. Scholars who go into and try to identify what the original teachings of the Buddha may have been, some of those view that in that way. It then became described as training the mind, which may or may not have been something from the Buddha himself, which was elaborated as ethics, meditation, and insight, or later still as wisdom. That's another one of those. It's a controversial term of whether it was one that the Buddha actually used in his teachings or it was one that came about later. Our primitive and subcortical brain, remember those, the early ones, responds to stimulus very quickly. Our cortex, however, allows us to intervene in that process and create a gap between stimulus and response. The gap gives us an opportunity to overcome our habitual response tendencies like anger or jealousy and make a choice in our response. So that's a very important principle as a part of this in order to enable us to achieve Buddhahood. The Buddha initially taught that the way out of our fundamental ignorance, the basic cause of our suffering, is to follow what we now call the Noble Eightfold Path. Now again, this is a level at which may have been taught by the Buddha, or it may be an addition later on. In any case, the Noble Eightfold Path includes training the mind, a new worldview. There is significant degree of interdependence among the 8 parts here of this path. Right, it's important to understand because each one has the word right at the beginning, right this, right that. In this context, it has the quality of completeness or fullness about it, as opposed to the sense of right versus wrong. Okay? So this completeness or fullness. So keep that in mind as we go through these. So the path consists of these 8. The first one, and these are in different sources, you'll find them organized in a different way. But the most common one is this one. First one is right way or right view. And it has 2 parts. The first part is an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, mastering self-discipline of body, speech, and mind, and then realizing that our actions have consequences as a part of that. I refer to that as the relative part of that truth. The second part, then, is a deep knowing the true nature of reality, through direct experience beyond intellectual knowledge, names, and labels. So this is the ultimate aspect of our understanding right view. Okay? So the second one is a more philosophical kind of a view, and the first one is more of a pragmatic point of a view, kind of things that we actually do day to day. So the second one is right thought or resolve. Develop thoughts of detachment from strong desires and aversions. We embrace the simple life and follow the path building thoughts of love and compassion for all. There's that term again. Qualities of the heart. Reject harm, violence, or hatred. Okay? So we're changing our thought, making this commitment. The third one is right speech. Don't lie, be divisive, use harsh words or idle talk, but speak the truth with loving speech, reconcile or harmonize, use pleasant words, and engage in meaningful talk. So this shows some of the characteristics of the 5 ethical things that we looked at, but it's a much broader view of those 5 standards. So number 4 is right conduct or actions. Build up our universal love and compassion for all. The Buddha taught for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world. So this also includes no killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, or greed, those 5 basic ones. And then number 5 is right livelihood. It's important to recognize here that some of these things actually apply to ordinary beings, not just to monastics. Okay? And certainly this one is characteristic because we're talking about a livelihood that the monastics don't engage in anyway. So right livelihood, number 5, abstain from work that brings harm to others or products that may cause harm. So the examples here, killing, weapons, poisons, intoxicants, prostitution, etc. So we talked about those a little bit more previously. Number 6 is right effort. It takes effort, it takes time and energy. So joyful or energetic will is including 1, keeping unwholesome actions, talk or thoughts from arising. Okay? So unwholesome things, we want to keep them from coming up in our life. The second one is getting rid of those that are already there. So we want to get rid of those and get the good, get rid of the bad. And then number 3 is helping unwholesome actions, talks or thoughts to arise. So not only do we want them to, we want to help them do that. And number 4, perfecting actions, talk, or thoughts already arisen. And so they're already there, so we just want to make them better than they have been previously. And then guarding the sense doors and sensory restraint. So the sense doors are 5 senses. So our eyes are like a sense door to seeing and so forth. So guarding the sense doors and sensory restraint. So when things happen and they come into our mind as a result of that, we need to pay attention to those and restrain the tendency that we often have to just instantly absorb those kind of things as either good or bad for example. So number 7 is right mindfulness, the awareness of our feelings for the most part, the pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Being aware of the mind itself, strong desires or not, hatred or not, delusion or not, distraction or concentrated. So these are things that we need to pay attention to in terms of the quality of our mindfulness. So we know how thoughts come and go, how they are delivered, suppressed, destroyed, and so forth. Number 8, the last of these, is right concentration. Here we are developing the 4 stages of the jhanas, or jhanas. A set of 4 practices that go through in stages. So cultivated states of mind from meditation, and may go beyond into further stages of 4 formless absorptions. So the original set of 4 actually comes from the Vedas. And the Buddha sometimes used things from the Vedas, as we pointed out, but other times rejected them. And it's a little bit more controversial whether or not these other 4 formless absorptions the Buddha actually recognized or not. There sometimes is just one of them that shows up in the texts, the early texts, or what we call the early texts, like the Pali Canon. Sometimes there's just 2. Occasionally there are just 3. It's very rare for all 4 of them to be there. So we don't know for sure, and we do know also that part of his everyday practice was those 4 stages of jhanas. And so whether he did the others or not, we don't know. But when we get into some advanced practices, what we will find is that they could still be helpful. Okay. So then Buddhism is not about meditating per se, which can be viewed as a tool, one of the ways of thinking about it, although meditating is certainly included, one of the 3 basics. And so Buddhism is about all of our lives and possibly future lives, reincarnation. We engage in wholesome thoughts, words, and deeds, and avoid unwholesome thoughts, words, and deeds. That is ethics. And we make a conscious effort to pay attention to all these throughout the day, and eventually even perhaps into our sleep in a dream state. And so ultimately meditation becomes a state of continuous consciousness. And so that's key. That's part of what we're training our mind to do, is to focus on and be aware of what's going on in our mind at all times, or what's going on around us as well. Like a slow-moving river 24/7, right livelihood could be part of right conduct. But here, the essence is that we should choose jobs that follow the ethics of moral or moral precepts from the very beginning. The Buddha addressed householders and not just monks and nuns. Right effort, mindfulness, and conduct focus on meditation. Right view is the result of the compassion, wisdom together that overcomes fundamental ignorance. So these actions are summarized as the 3 trainings: ethics, meditation, and wisdom, or an understanding of those. So that's where we're going to cut it off for today. Now, we haven't quite finished the 2nd chapter, so we will continue that in the 2nd session. And so also you will have 2 more chapters, 3 and 4. They're shorter, much shorter chapters, and so that hopefully will be sufficient for us to cover the whole rest of this and the next one as well, the other 2 chapters. So again, email me if you have any questions or comments. One suggestion that I like to make is when you are reading, if you have questions of words that come up, including English words. I sometimes find it helpful even there, but even especially some of the words from other foreign languages, whether it is from the Pali language or the Sanskrit language or the Tibetan language and so forth. There's others as well. Looking in the dictionary can be very helpful. I call it Guru Google. And so for both of those kinds of words, they can be very helpful in trying to explain it. But one of the things that I think you need to be careful with, AI is taking over a lot of that. And it is getting better, but it's still not perfect. So you need to be cautious about the meanings that come up from that. And so one caution related to AI is, and it can actually be just when you're doing a search, it doesn't have to be with the intention of it being AI. Is that you want to include some key words, not just the particular word that you're looking for, but it's good to also include things like Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism or some other element of what it is that you're trying to find out about. And then you'll get a much better, more accurate kind of presentation. So be as specific as you can if you're using Guru Google to help. So please abide softly and deeply in pure awareness with loving kindness and compassion, always and always. And please pray for peace. Thank you very much.